The search dogs stopped at the edge of the property, not because they found Gus Lamont, because they lost him completely. No scent trail leading into the scrub, no footprints moving away from the homestead, no sign a 4-year-old child had crossed the dirt road surrounding Oak Park Station at all. It was as if he had vanished exactly where he was standing. And for investigators, that detail would become impossible to forget. Because children disappear, but they do not usually disappear without disturbing the landscape around them. Especially not in the Australian outback, especially not here. Welcome to the Hidden Chapters, uncovering the truth behind every crime. Oak Park Station sits near Yunta in South Australia. Remote doesn't fully describe it. The property stretches across vast, dry terrain where distances are deceptive and the silence feels heavy enough to notice. The roads are narrow and dusty. Old equipment sits rusting in the heat. Mine shafts cut deep into the earth around the property, some partially hidden by scrub and rock. At night, there are almost no artificial lights beyond the homestead itself, and in late September, sunset comes quickly. By the evening of September 27th, 2025, the station looked exactly as it always had. Quiet, still, normal. 4-year-old Augustus Gus Lamont was outside near the family home. Relatives later told investigators he had been playing near a dirt mound around 5 p.m. Nothing unusual about it. Children played outside constantly on properties like this. There was space everywhere, and everyone knew everyone. But somewhere within the next 30 minutes, something happened. When Gus's grandmother went outside to call him in, he was gone. At first, there was no panic. Families living remotely are used to children wandering short distances. They checked nearby sheds, vehicles, water tanks, around fences and machinery. They called his name across the property. Nothing. Then the mood changed. Because the station was open country, there were hazards everywhere. Deep shafts, dam water, rusted scrap, and darkness was approaching fast. By the time police were contacted later that evening, the disappearance was already becoming something far more serious than a lost child report. Because nobody could explain how Gus had disappeared so quickly, or why no one had seen him leave. The first responding officers treated the property like a critical missing person scene almost immediately. Search teams began moving outward from the homestead in expanding patterns. Vehicles swept dirt tracks surrounding the station. SES volunteers arrived through the night. Then came mounted police, drones, thermal imaging helicopters, and specialist search crews. Investigators focused heavily on the terrain closest to where Gus was last seen, because in cases involving young children, statistics matter. Children that age rarely travel long distances alone, especially through harsh terrain. Usually, searchers begin finding indicators quickly. Small footprints, disturbed dirt, broken vegetation, clothing caught on wire fencing. Or at least something. But Oak Park Station wasn't giving them anything back, and that started troubling investigators very early. Search crews examined roads surrounding the property looking for tire marks or signs of vehicle movement. Nothing unusual was publicly identified. Officers searched abandoned structures and machinery where a child might become trapped. Again, nothing. Then attention shifted toward the mine shafts. The station contained multiple old shafts scattered across the land, some narrow, unstable, and descending deep underground. Specialist crews were brought in. Cameras were lowered. Some shafts had to be physically entered and searched. It was dangerous work, but investigators could not ignore the possibility. They couldn't still find any information leading to the disappearance. Then there were the dams, large bodies of murky water sitting across isolated terrain. At one point, police drained millions of liters from a dam connected to the property. Searchers combed through mud, debris, and thick sediment by hand. Nothing. No trace of Gus. Not a shoe. Not fabric. Not biological evidence publicly linked to him. For many investigators, the absence itself was becoming evidence, because a child disappearing naturally from that environment should have left behind some kind of physical story. But this scene was almost unnaturally clean. As days passed, investigators became increasingly careful with their language. Publicly, police continued referring to Gus as a missing child. But behind the scenes, the direction of the investigation was changing. Experienced detectives understand behavioral timelines. In remote area disappearances, patterns emerge quickly: search radius, travel distance, environmental exposure. But Gus's case was beginning to move outside those patterns. The lack of physical evidence mattered. So did the timing. So did conflicting accounts investigators were beginning to analyze from people connected to the property. Eventually, Detective Superintendent Darren Fielke revealed investigators had identified inconsistencies and discrepancies in statements. It was one sentence, but it changed the tone of the entire case. Because police rarely use language like that publicly unless confidence inside the investigation has already shifted. And then came another major development. Authorities announced Gus Lamont's disappearance was now being treated as a major crime investigation. And that was the moment many Australians stopped believing this was simply a tragic wandering case. Because investigators also revealed something else. They had identified a suspect, not a stranger, someone known to Gus, someone connected to the property. But police did not release further details publicly, and that silence created an entirely different kind of fear. Because now the question wasn't whether something happened. It was who knew about it. Detectives continued returning to Oak Park Station for months. That detail mattered, because investigators do not repeatedly search the same property at that scale unless they believe something may still be there. Each new search operation seemed more targeted than the last. Specific areas were examined again, ground was revisited, structures re-entered, machinery rechecked. At times, investigators appeared less focused on finding a lost child and more focused on finding hidden evidence. Police never publicly disclosed every forensic technique used during the investigation. But major crime scenes involving missing children typically involve detailed soil analysis, scent tracking, timeline reconstruction, digital examination of devices, vehicle movement analysis, and repeated witness re-interviews. And as the months passed, another detail emerged publicly. Some family members connected to the property had reportedly stopped cooperating with investigators. Not Gus's parents. Other relatives. That detail intensified scrutiny immediately. Why stop cooperating in an active missing child investigation? What exactly had police asked them? What contradictions were detectives trying to resolve? The deeper the investigation moved inward toward the property itself, the more unsettling the case became. Because investigators no longer seemed to be searching the Outback for answers. They appeared to be searching people. Subscribe and stay with us, because this investigation is still unfolding. Part of what made the Gus Lamont case spread so rapidly across Australia was how psychologically wrong it felt. People understand accidents. They understand children getting lost. But this case resisted ordinary explanations. A 4-year-old vanishing in remote terrain should create a chain reaction of evidence. Movement. Damage. Noise. A timeline investigators can physically follow. Instead, the case seemed to collapse inward. Almost every road led back to the property itself, and the public noticed that shift. Online forums became consumed by the investigation. People analyzed aerial maps of Oak Park Station, measured distances. They studied police press conferences for changes in wording and body language. Some became convinced investigators already knew what happened, but lacked enough evidence to prove it. Others believed the Outback itself had destroyed crucial evidence before search teams arrived. But regardless of theory, one detail remained impossible to ignore. Police searched relentlessly and still found nothing. That absence became the defining feature of the case, not what investigators discovered, what they didn't. As public interest intensified, so did pressure surrounding the family. Media crews traveled to the isolated station repeatedly. Reporters waited near access roads hoping for updates. At one point, confrontations involving journalists and relatives connected to the property made national headlines. Meanwhile, Gus's parents released emotional public statements pleading for information. Their son had vanished without explanation, and every day without answers seemed to deepen the nightmare surrounding the property. What made the case especially heartbreaking was Gus's age, 4 years old, still young enough to depend entirely on the adults around him, still young enough that investigators believed he likely could not have traveled far on his own. That fact quietly shaped much of the investigation from the beginning, because if Gus didn't go far, then where did he go? And who was with him during those missing 30 minutes? By early 2026, investigators had spent months reconstructing movements, verifying statements, and searching the property surrounding Oak Park Station. No body had been found. No confirmed physical evidence had been publicly released connecting anyone to harming Gus. No charges had been laid. And yet police continued treating the disappearance as a major crime investigation. That contradiction is what continues haunting the case. Investigators clearly believe the truth is not random, not accidental, not explainable by a child simply wandering into the Outback alone. But whatever happened during that 30-minute window has remained hidden. Somewhere inside the silence surrounding Oak Park Station is an explanation investigators still haven't been able to fully uncover. And until that changes, the disappearance of Gus Lamont remains one of the most disturbing mysteries Australia has seen in years. Today, parts of Oak Park Station have been searched multiple times. Mine shafts entered, dams drained, ground revisited. Timelines reconstructed repeatedly. Still no trace of Gus Lamont has ever been publicly found. No final answer, no resolution. Just a missing child, an isolated property, and 30 unexplained minutes investigators still cannot fully account for. Because somewhere between 5 p.m. and nightfall on September 27, 2025, a 4-year-old boy disappeared, and according to police, the truth may have never left the property at all. If major developments emerge in the Gus Lamont investigation, we'll continue covering them here, because this case is far from over.
If this case stayed with you, you're not the only one. And if you're ready for the details most people miss, there's more waiting in the full Hidden Chapters playlist.